if it can actually introduce better technology, it may even be able to reduce its demand for labor in order to accommodate the increased demand for cloth in the Portuguese wine sector. And of course, this creates a serious international trade problem, because of course, what happens in England? Portuguese wine imports are much cheaper and much better than English wine. This destroys employment in the English wine industry, as vines are rooted up because they can't sell this rubbish English wine for high prices anymore. The effect of that is that the demand for clothes in the English wine industry goes down, and simultaneously labor is released, which needs jobs in the cloth industry. The effect of that is that the cloth industry also contracts, and that will go on happening until at some point Portuguese wine and cloth producers have reached their optimum level of output and diminishing returns set in and allow some kind of exports to happen from England, or the English massively reduce wages in order to send exports of cloth to Portugal. So what we can see is that Portugal gains and England loses until all the surplus labor in Portugal is being absorbed, and this continues for as long as the new technology in either sector allows it to keep its costs below its English competitors by expanding its output and exports. So this then creates not only a massive increase in inequality, but also a systemic crisis. Because of course, at the point at which English wine and cloth producers lose their jobs, they will have to reduce their consumption of Portuguese wine and cloth, and quite rapidly there will be a systemic crisis, because of course the import compression in England will then mean that the Portuguese producers who've been making money out of these surpluses will have to cut their production, and that will then generate a downward spiral. And that's why I think it's probably true to say that the Chinese are finding it increasingly hard to maintain their exports to a lot of their third world markets where import compression is taking place. So here, rapid technological change increases output and potential welfare, but also increases tendency to monopoly, inequality, and breakdown. So incorporating it into our model explains some of the most challenging issues that confront modern society. Constant destruction of old firms, barriers to entry, structural unemployment, balance of payments disequilibria, and unsustainable environmental degradation. And as I've said, liberal theory has attributed these problems in the past to perverse interventionist policy. And although I'm very willing to acknowledge that these policies can and have had massively perverse and regressive effects in many cases, we only have to understand why the average Russian owner of a Trabant, East German owner of a Trabant, when the wall came down, drove their cars to the border, left them on the border, and walked across to buy a Volkswagen, to understand how perverse structuralist controls can produce technological backwardness and other kinds of disequilibria. But it does seem to me that that analysis that I've given you of what happens when we actually have real technological change in these industries. And I have a house in the south of France, and when I first went there in 1976, there were vines all around the house that were operating on old-style principles. All of those have now been dug up, and the few farms that are still there are using advanced technologies, and most of the people who had those farms are now doing something else or probably living on welfare. So it does seem to me that we have to recognize that these scale economies are the central driving force in capitalist development. Indeed, as Schumpeter rightly points out, it is these economies of scale that actually have transformed the world and created many, if not most, of the opportunities that we have. But at the same time, it seems to me that we also have to acknowledge the consequences of their disruptive effects. And I will argue that we can only deal with those disruptions by accepting the need for conscious social and political controls to transfer resources from strong regions, strong firms, strong societies to poor people, not only in poor countries, but also in rich countries. Before doing that, let me just put in another set of caveats about the benefits of market systems. That case that I've just made to you is the case that I was making very strongly, rather intemperately, in the 1980s. What I would just want to add to that is that I have certainly recognized since then that there are a number of countervailing forces that do operate through market processes that actually do offset these tendencies to instability and disintegration. What I think we can see is that diminishing returns will destabilize social systems unless they are accompanied by what Marx called countervailing tendencies. That is to say, countervailing technological and other tendencies that encourage new entrants and generate the resources needed to support social cohesion. So, in order to sort of defend myself from an anti-market bias, and indeed I'm not anti-market, I believe in institutional pluralism, an effective symbiotic relationship between market states and social institutions. I just take you through what seem to me to be the key variables that do offset these tendencies to centralization, that is to say, the transfer of new technologies to new regions, the replacement of old firms by new ones, and the ability of successful societies to maximize social order, create social nets, social security nets, sustain increasingly complex civic, ethical, and cultural activities. Processes that can and often have been blocked by perverse policy interventions that undermine the positive effects of market solutions. Indeed, that depend upon the existence of open markets and competition that encourage the emergence of new firms and strengthen state and civic institutions. The underlying processes here are those identified in the sort of Hicks, Ricardo, Lewis models, but let me just set them up. As I've already said, the dependency theory argument that capitalism meant that the periphery could never industrialize because it would never encourage the transfer of productive activity to third world countries was decisively proved to be wrong. And I think the major reason why that was the case was not because of market failures, not because of economies of scale, but because of protectionism in DCs, in developed countries. So the reductions in tariffs and the improvements in capital flows and all of those kinds of things that have happened since the end of the 1950s up to the present have in fact opened up opportunities for industrialization in third world countries and do account for the massive shift of industries from developed countries to newly industrialized countries that we've seen over the past few years. And of course, if those tariffs had not been reduced, that process would not have produced the positive effects that it has. Second, growth in wages and investment in high technology sectors. So when we create new, more productive industries in a high technology sector, this, on the basis of what economists call Say's law, produce additional demand, because every investment in a new sector, all the wages that are created have then got to be spent elsewhere. That creates new demand for either existing old industries or for new industries, and creates demand for inputs and consumer goods that sustain jobs and suppliers. That can include small enterprises in the informal sector and strengthen inclusion. Thirdly, free trade allows scale-reducing technological change to occur. So not all technological change increases scale economy. Some of it enables smaller firms with lower investment to actually become more productive. The obvious example of this was the introduction of the microchip that destroyed IBM's computer monopoly in the 1970s, 1980s. At the end of the 60s and early 70s, IBM controlled 80% of the global computer market. The only other companies that survived did so because they had government backing. As soon as the new computer technology came online, IBM basically no longer produces computers, or it may have just restarted, and a huge array of new companies were able to emerge. The destruction of the old telephone monopoly through the creation of mobile phones has facilitated an IT revolution, and mobile phones are now seen as the access to mobile phones has been a major